Hello and welcome to Joan Comrie's Feeding Tips. My name is Joan Comrie and today we're going to talk about sensory issues as it's related to feeding and swallowing disorders. And sensory issues can influence feeding development from the infant all the way through toddler age and school age children, but today we're just going to talk about infants. So when I get a referral to do an evaluation on an infant's feeding difficulties, I'm looking at the sensory components and the motor components of that baby. And the sensory can entail all of the senses, but today I'm going to talk about oral sensory difficulties. Those difficulties can also influence oral motor patterns, but I'm going to talk about that at another time. I'm just going to try to isolate sensory, even though a lot of times they influence each other so much that you're, as a speech pathologist specializing in feeding and swallowing disorders, I'm looking to see what has most influence, and those are the patterns that I'm probably going to try to target first. So if you have a baby that has sensory difficulties, what does that look like? So that would be the baby who can, from a motor standpoint, open their mouth wide enough to get a good latch, but then pulls into a really shallow latch. Or a baby who only accepts the very front of the bottle nipple, or only likes bottles that have really short nipples because they don't like more input into their mouth. Maybe it gags them, or maybe they just kind of refuse those patterns or push the nipples out because they don't like to have the touch on the tongue. And as you can understand from some of the videos that I've been talking about, that medial tongue is a really important place that needs to be comfortable with tactile input or touch on that middle tongue for it to work and for it to function correctly. And if a baby doesn't like touch on the middle of the tongue, that's going to change the way that that baby patterns their tongue and is going to influence their motor patterns and cause a lot of difficulty and pain with feeding, or maybe poor milk transfer, all kinds of difficulty, maybe even choking and aspirating because the tongue pattern is not developing correctly because the sensory piece won't allow that motor pattern to work and function correctly. So what does a person do if they suspect that their baby has a sensory difficulty? One of the best things to do is to find a specialist that understands sensory motor feeding disorders in infants. And that person, like myself, so what I would be doing is working with the baby therapeutically to desensitize that sensory system to increase tolerance of touch in the correct place so that the motor patterns can function correctly. And I would be teaching that to the baby, and I also would be training mom and dad on those exercises to work on at home to facilitate correct patterning for feeding. And so next time, so let me summarize what I want to talk about. So first of all, if you have a baby that has a sensory difficulty, that's going to be a baby that gags easily where they shouldn't be gagging. And if a baby's gagging in the front of their mouth, that's too forward. They should not be gagging unless you're way in the back of the mouth. And as you know, with feeding, the baby should draw that nipple into the middle of that tongue and more towards the posterior tongue to have most effective sucking patterns. And so if that baby's sensory system doesn't allow the touch in the correct place, then that's going to influence the motor system and not allow the motor system to be as effective as it needs to be. And so if you have a baby that has those sensory issues, you will want to find a professional that can help you work through and teach you the strategies and the exercises to work on with your baby to reduce that sensory aversion or the sensory defensiveness, because correct sensory patterns are going to allow correct motor patterns, and you need a combination of good motor and good sensory patterns to have an effective feeder. I hope that's helpful. Thanks.